In terms of structure, I think we're going to show a quick 7-minute video with the general background. Then we're going to jump into panel discussion between the 4 participants and then open up for Q&A. So with that, I'll give it to Jim, who's going to introduce the video. Enjoy.
Okay, so mostly what I wanted to do in this very brief intervention is thank ILS and CERLA for organizing this event. I'm thrilled that we had a great turnout. We'll start with the video, which is done by an advocacy organization, and then after that, we'll walk you through how we got, not just to this video, but this report, why, some of the issues involved, and how it's relevant to a law school clinic, and the kinds of things that, while in law school, you may or may not want to do or care to do in terms of advocacy related to international law and international human rights law. So we're going to turn off the lights, and that's the play button. Let's see what happens. Sorry. There you go.
Most of the media coverage and the U.S. government line in the United States is that drone strikes are very precise and they target with surgical precision particular militants and terrorists.
What we have documented is that drones kill not only terrorists, they kill many others, they kill civilians, they have killed women and children.
We went to Pakistan in 2 separate investigation missions to speak with people who themselves had experienced drone strikes.
The result of our research is a report entitled Living Under Drones. We were particularly concerned about drones because our own government is involved in using drones. And we believe there has not been adequate oversight of the use of drones and the basis for deciding who gets killed, where, and when. We gained access to the people in what's called the Fatah region, federally administered tribal areas in Pakistan. That's an area that is cordoned off and into which virtually no one can enter. We were able to speak to people from that area who came out to other parts of Pakistan and to interview with us. One of the things we found is that there are entire communities who live in areas where drones are flying overhead 24 hours a day, 7 days a week at times. And these people don't know when those drones will strike. They don't know who they will strike. The result is symptoms of psychological disorder, of trauma, of severe anxiety, and of dysfunctionality. We heard stories of people who won't leave their houses.
The drones doesn't buy like a one day because there is yet a side was अक्सर खलक को दोनों ज़्यादा ज़िंदगी प्रेशर अपना चौड़ शोड़ दे प्रेशर वाला
psychiatrists and psychologists who had treated people with these symptoms, they said that a number of people displayed very serious symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD.
We may not have declared war on Pakistan, but for the people living in northwest Pakistan under drones, they're in a war zone. One of the things we found and documented were incidents of double tapping.
There'll be an initial strike on a target, and then very shortly after, a secondary strike. What has happened in the period between the first and the second strike is that neighbors or people nearby or family members, or in some cases doctors, have come to assist those who may have been injured and still survived.
And when they're doing that, a second drone has hit. The people with whom we spoke in the communities affected, almost without exception, told us, when there's a drone strike, we won't go near afterwards. And we even heard this from some medical professionals.
Extremely angry at the United States.
The New York Times recently classified drones in a piece as the new Guantanamo, the new recruiting tool for Al Qaeda. One of the things we heard from several people is that they didn't know what America was before drones. And now what they know of America is drones, death, and terror.
One person we interviewed asked me, do American people know what these drone strikes are doing? Do American people know the strikes are killing civilians here? And people said to us, we want you to go back, now that you've spoken to us, and tell the American public the impact that drone policies are having.
Through our report, we would like the American people to understand that the narrative that they have heard about drones is not accurate. That drones cause death to civilians, they terrorize entire populations, and they may well be counterproductive at many levels.
We need to rethink our policies in light of the disastrous impact the drone strikes are having on the people who live under them.
Okay, so I thought we'd start over with a video, which is not the usual medium for expression in law school. It's not the ordinary medium of expression for law clinics or human rights clinics, although increasingly we're moving towards thinking about and engaging in other forms of advocacy other than courts, litigation, report writing, documentation, etc. We're starting with the video. What we wanted to do now is sort of walk back and from the beginning give you a sense of how the project developed, and then what were some of the issues and challenges we faced in investigating and documenting what we did, what we found substantively, and then sort of conclusions, recommendations moving forward. So there are several of us who are going to speak, so we will each be succinct. I want to give you some background, and then we're going to, Adelina and Omar and Stephan will address issues related to background, law, strategy, and the consequences to people living under drones of the daily surveillance and the threat of strikes from drones. So how did we get involved? We were approached by a UK charity, an NGO in British English, which represents a number of victims of drone strikes in litigation both in Pakistan and in the United Kingdom. And they asked us if we would research and document the consequences in Pakistan of drone strikes. In particular because at that time, the official statements, to the extent that there had been statements from U.S. authorities, indicated that there were either no civilian casualties from drone strikes in Pakistan, or that the drone strike casualties in Pakistan were in the single digits. And that widespread belief, though inaccurate, had an impact, or was having an impact, on their ability to use courts to seek justice for individuals who had been harmed or killed in drone strikes. So that's how we began, and we started a process of research. We spent 2 quarters and then the summer working on this, thousands of pieces of information in news media, books, reports, pretty much everything we could read about what was happening, and then 2 trips to Pakistan. One of the big advantages, and I'll put in a plug for Stanford here, of the full-time clinical structure that we have is that we could go to Pakistan during the quarter because the students in the clinic did not have other courses, other classes, which you would in other law schools, and spend 2 or 3 weeks at a time in Pakistan. So that, just to give you a bit of the methodology, we explained this, we went to Pakistan because what we felt was missing in the equation were the narratives and first-hand testimony of people who were living under drones. What we were getting, and Adelina can talk about this when she talks about numbers and data aggregation and media sources to some extent, what we would read, what one reads in the Western media is information that comes out of the region in which drones strike, which is an area called FATA, the federally administered tribal areas in northwest Pakistan. And that was information that is provided almost exclusively by off-the-record governmental sources from the United States or from Pakistan. The reason why that is the area is cordoned off. It's cordoned off by the Pakistani military, so one cannot enter into FATA. So the narratives of people living under drones were not being heard. And what we decided to do, and what we were able to do, was to bring people from FATA to Islamabad, to Peshawar, and speak with people also in Lahore and Islamabad and Rawalpindi, medical professionals, others, people who had lived in this region, others who were familiar with what was going on, and about 70 first-hand witnesses of drone strikes, victims of drone strikes, survivors of drone strikes, people who lost relatives, etc. And based on that, we pulled together this report, which led to that video. So I'm going to leave it there as sort of a background, how we got involved and what we did, and then we'll walk you through some other aspects and angles of the report.
No, that's fine. Is there, can everybody see the PowerPoint going up? Just the lights? Okay, great. Okay, so as Jim mentioned, I want to talk through a little bit, if you're going to be sitting down, but I want to access the PowerPoint. Talk through where the numbers that you read about in newspapers and media and online come from, what the problems with those data sources are, and just the limitations on what really can be known about the precise figures of who's being killed and where in FATA and by whom. So to start, the official reports, meaning the reports that come from U.S. intelligence and White House sources. We have covered several problems with the reports that come out of the U.S. government. First and foremost, I think, is the terminology. Generally speaking, all government reports refer only to militants, and if they ever actually address civilian deaths, might use the term civilian, but primarily the primary word is militant. The problem with the word militant is it does not make any key distinctions that I think are really important to assessing the actual impact of a strike and the legality of a strike. First and foremost, anyone who falls into the category of militant is not necessarily a lawful target under international humanitarian law or international human rights law. I think Omar is going to talk a little bit more about the subtleties of that distinction later, but in terms of determining whether or not the U.S.'s drone program is lawful, you really have to know who you're going after, who you're actually killing, and whether they actually do pose an imminent threat to the United States. The New York Times revealed in May of this past year that the White House considers any military-age males who happen to be killed in a drone strike to be militants by virtue of having been killed, unless any posthumous intelligence affirmatively proves them to be civilians. That's troubling because we actually have no record of the United States, or in very few cases does the United States or the CIA or even the Pakistani military or intelligence actually investigate or follow up on drone strikes. I think Jim may have mentioned Fatah is a very difficult place to access. It's a semi-autonomous region. Even residents of the 4 provinces of Pakistan do not enter Fatah. There is a military presence there, but they're limited and they tend to be rather insulated in their bases on the ground. And there are very few U.S. ground troops there, if any. There may be some CIA operatives, but there's very little evidence, public or private, that we've been able to find that suggests that anyone regularly or routinely visits the drone strike site to find out who was killed. Moreover, as both witnesses and government sources will tell you, the mass majority of strike victims are obliterated to the point that they couldn't be identified. Hellfire missiles, drones are equipped with Hellfire missiles, which are incendiary blast devices, so they burn. Structures burn, bodies burn, cars burn. Most witnesses who have visited strike sites talk about, pieces of burned flesh scattered everywhere, meat hanging off of things. I mean, there's really no way to identify, even so, in many cases, how many people were there, much less who they were, who they knew, what they were involved in, or really, whether they were legitimate targets or not. And so it's generally understood that most official reports don't make that distinction. They fall back on the easy terminology of saying 8 militants were killed. Sometimes they'll say 8 to one newspaper, 10 to another, 5 to another newspaper. But regardless, the terms are generally, I think, untrustworthy and so vague as to not be particularly helpful. Secondly, that leads to conflicting media reports. Media, depending on the source, I think the most reliable sources of information on drone strike, although not terribly reliable, are the major Western wire services and major publications like AP, Reuters, New York Times, The Guardian, UK, and then also some major and credible Pakistani news outlets like The News, The Nation, The Daily Times. They tend to first go to those official sources which have the problems we talked about, Pakistani officials, American officials, and get some anonymous quotes from them about what's going on. But some reporters really do try to make an effort to do on-the-ground research. The problem is they can't get into Fatah for the most part, or if they do, they're usually in a military envelope, very heavily supervised, they're maybe helicoptered in for a few hours and taken back out again. So there is trouble getting accurate information, and many do rely on stringers on the ground in Fatah, locals who have connections to wire service reporters stationed in Islamabad or Lahore, who will try and provide them with some information. Stringers are tricky because they generally have good contacts on the ground. They're able to actually talk to people who knew victims, to actually figure out where the strikes are happening and get information about who's being killed. But the problem there is they are subject to intense pressure from Pakistani military, from US and Pakistani intelligence, and from Taliban. There are reports of at least a dozen individuals that have been killed, or a dozen reporters who have been killed in the last few years in Fatah. There's suggestions that Musharraf, when he was president of Pakistan, ordered the deaths of several through Pakistani intelligence. So, as you can understand, there's pressure from all sides to adjust numbers or to inflate or deflate civilian casualty reports. So, generally, media is not the question. And I've put up some examples here of conflicting reports about the same strike. You can see the range of data that comes out of newspaper accounts. Statistics generally in the U.S. press come from 3 major online strike data aggregators: the Long War Journal, the European Drone Project, and the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. These 3 sources aggregate newspaper reports. In the report, we analyzed the data from all of them and uncovered some pretty significant problems with particularly the Long War Journal, but most importantly the New American Foundation, which is the most cited and whose executive director is a security analyst for CNN. New America made a bunch of claims this year that there were no civilian casualties in 2012 and pointed to that as an improvement in Obama's drone program. Our partner group at NYU looked at all of their data and figured out that actually they had culled a set of newspaper accounts that reported only military or only militant deaths and omitted any newspaper accounts that reported civilian deaths. There have been at least 6 credible, not necessarily confirmed, but credible reports of civilian deaths, such in 2012, such that it is perhaps not correct to say there have been civilians, but it is decidedly incorrect to say there have been none, because the fact is we just don't know. The Bureau of Investigative Journalism, for our purposes, we determined is the most accurate. They do have the highest civilian count, but they actually aggregate the highest number of credible news articles. They also have investigators on the ground. They've made trips to Pakistan. They also post conflicting evidence so that you can look at their data and decide for yourself which are the more credible reports. So generally, when we've used statistics in this report, we've relied on them with the caveat that absolutely no one knows what's actually going on or the precise number of civilian deaths that have occurred. I think I may hold off and do this since we're out of time. We can talk a bit more. We do want to, if you want to read the report, there are some more colorful narratives. We tried to tell the stories of a few particular strikes in long form based on interviews with multiple people who could share their experiences about those strikes. We may have time to talk about them later, but some of the voices you heard in the video, we do have the full story, the background, the context, the aftermath of the drone and what those people experienced. So this is that's
Great. Yeah, so whenever you're doing this kind of work, I think it's inevitable, so because we're doing this in a law school setting, I think it's inevitable to prepare for just the personal and emotive impact of speaking with individuals who have experienced this. So as Jim was saying before, a lot of the folks that we spoke with were either themselves direct victims, so they had survived a drone attack in some way, or they were family members or people who had directly witnessed a drone attack. And so one of the things that really became clear to us and in drafting the report that we really highlighted was the daily impact of drones, not just on the specific individuals who are targeted or the specific individuals who are family members or people who we might traditionally consider direct victims, but really on entire communities. And the sort of broad impact that it has on daily life in Fatah, and how it really has shut down or changed the way life is lived in that region. And that region, to be clear, did not have great socioeconomic indicators to start with, so it's a real issue. Life in Fatah is very, very difficult. So we broke it down in a number of different categories. First of all, as we mentioned, a lot of this has been covered in the video, but as we found that there is actually, in terms of humanitarian duty to provide assistance to individuals who were hurt or harmed, there's a real hesitation, both among regular citizens when they see that there's some kind of a drone strike or that there's somebody who's injured in the ground, lying on the ground or something. There's a large hesitation to actually go and help that person because of this double tap pattern where oftentimes there's a second drone strike immediately following or a couple of minutes later following the first one. So people are literally left on their own, or if they do intervene or if they do go to help, they know that it's at a very great risk to their lives. And that's not just regular civilians, regular citizens, regular neighbors. It's also medical professionals who are committed to that kind of, providing that kind of service. So that's one thing, one issue that we found to be very troubling. And it's not just us who think that if this is in fact what's happening, that is something that would be of great concern, also legally. Then we found, and this stands to reason, that drone strikes, no matter who's targeted, typically cause a lot more economic and property damage than is regularly acknowledged. So imagine that your house, if you're a regular household, your house, your property is destroyed in some way, particularly when you're living a tenuous existence, as many people are in the Fatah region. It tends to really undermine significantly the livelihood strategies that that family or that household has just to stay alive, to feed their families, those sorts of things. A lot of times people are targeted and the primary breadwinner is either injured or can no longer, or some significant piece of property that that family has that they rely on in order to sustain themselves, like a taxi or something like that, is destroyed or damaged, and so they can no longer carry out life. The implications of that oftentimes sort of happen in the shadows. You have children who no longer can get food. You have families who are living a much more tenuous existence. And then, of course, we talked a lot about the mental health impacts. So that extends beyond just the people who are primarily targeted, but entire communities. They are well aware every time this sort of buzzing noise, which was described to us several times, sort of a zoom, zoom, zoom type noise. In fact, there's a word that people repeat to us oftentimes that they use to describe this noise. It's a constant reminder of something that's totally uncontrollable. Sort of a reminder of death or destruction. And people who have nothing to do, who've never witnessed a drone strike, mention to us how they've actually changed their lives, or they've changed their regular pattern of behavior just because of this constant presence. So for example, some fathers spoke of no longer really feeling comfortable sending their children to schools. The issue of access to education has been in the news a lot recently in Pakistan. And drones are certainly one factor that it sounds like leads some families in the Fatah area to really be concerned about sending their children to areas where they might be targeted for whatever reason. And other types of events like burials or weddings, any kind of event where a lot of people congregate. In the Fatah area, a lot of times community disputes are resolved when elders come together and they sort of hash out differences or disputes or questions just that are fundamental to the governance of that community. Each one of those instances, people have described to us how they're no longer comfortable, or in fact, they're no longer engaging in those kind of just regular civil activities. So the report goes into some greater detail there, but it really does highlight a total erosion of everyday life in the Fatah area, and particularly the way that people interact on a fundamental level.
Great. So what I want to talk about a little bit in my 7-8 minutes is the kind of legal and strategic considerations that are behind drone strikes. You've heard a little bit about the numbers of casualties and the everyday terror of living under drones, but what are the legal and strategic implications? So starting with legal, the first thing that we have to note is that the limited amount of transparency around the program makes it very difficult to reach definitive legal conclusions. So in our report, we don't really offer many strong, conclusive legal findings, because in the absence of basic information, such as Adelina pointed out, who is killed in particular strikes, or what is the legal basis for the strike, or what groups are being targeted, it's really difficult to kind of make those kind of conclusions. And the United States has continually failed to kind of provide this kind of information, even though both international humanitarian law and international human rights law imposes important obligations with regards to transparency when committing acts of these sorts. So I want to just briefly sketch out what are some of the legal issues that are out there that we kind of weigh and consider in the report, and that should be behind our thinking as law students when we assess the legality of drone strikes. I think the first thing is to say there is the use ad bellum and the use in bello kind of considerations. So what that basically means is that the considerations about the recourse to force generally, whether or not using force in Pakistan violates the sovereignty of Pakistan, and then there's a second set of questions around whether or not that particular use of force is legal or not. So whether or not you can use force in the first place, and then secondly, whether or not a particular use of force is legal. So briefly, the first area about the recourse to force, the use ad bellum kind of considerations, Article 2.4 of the UN Charter has a categorical prohibition on the use of force. However, there are two notable exceptions. The first is the consent of the particular state. And in the case of Pakistan, while WikiLeaks and other sources report that there have been Pakistani consent for drone strikes, there really are some questions now, given recent public statements by many Pakistani officials, the foreign minister, the president, that have intensified in the last year about whether or not they continue to consent to strikes. The second exception has to do with self-defense in response to an armed attack, or in response to an imminent threat, when the host state is not willing or able to take action to stop that threat. Of course, there are many legal questions, and if you take Weiner's international law class, you'll delve into all sorts of questions about whether or not you can use self-defense against non-state actors, around what constitutes an armed attack, around whether or not there even is a right to anticipatory self-defense. All I'll say for now is that our report raises questions, one, about the eminence of the threat, which under international law under the Caroline case has to be instant and overwhelming, leaving no choice of means and no time for deliberation. And as the UN Special Rapporteur Christoph Haynes has written, killings carried out in 2012, he casts doubt on whether killings carried out in 2012 can be justified as a response to an event that occurred 11 years prior. So we'll leave that at that. We raised some questions under the jus ad bellum. Turning to the jus ad bellum, there are kind of two different bodies of law that govern whether or not a particular event or attack is legal. And really the distinction between them, one being international humanitarian law and the other being international human rights law, turns on whether or not you're in a state of armed conflict. And that's based on a set of objective criteria, such as the threshold or intensity of the violence, such as the identifiability or the organization of the particular groups. The United States immediately assumes we're in an armed conflict and applies international humanitarian law, even though experts have raised questions about that. And again, our report notes some of these questions. But briefly, if we accept international humanitarian law as the governing standard, our report casts doubt on the legality of drone strikes in kind of 5 ways, which I'll just preliminarily sketch out. The first is the legality of strikes that include a large number of civilians, such as attacks on mosques, on funerals, on schools, some of the things we document on our report. There are questions about whether or not that is proportional, and proportionality is one of the key tests under international humanitarian law. Secondly, there are what's called signature strikes, which really are something that doing our research, we've realized has become more and more prevalent, especially under the Obama administration. And signature strikes, unlike strikes that are based on kill lists and target particular leaders of armed non-state groups, signature strikes attack based on profiles of behavior, right? So, and we don't know the criteria that are used to lead to signature strikes, but our report raises questions about whether or not you can ensure under international humanitarian law that you're attacking a legitimate target when you're attacking based on profiles of behavior. The third area is attacks, and this has been noted by Stephan and in the video, on first responders or on rescuers, which is questionable under the principle of distinction. And I think fourth, and the quote Adelina put on about the New York Times, if the United States considers militants to be any military-aged men, absent evidence post-fact that they were actually civilians, that really raises question about whether the requisite test is being met to ensure that they are legitimate targets. And finally, we raise questions about the necessity of drone strikes. And we've done some research about correlating the timing of strikes with particular events in U.S.-Pakistani relations. And we cite a report by the Congressional Research Services that says that oftentimes drone strikes are used as messaging to Pakistan and the Pakistani government. And if it's being used as a tool to further political negotiations, how necessary are they for security? And the last point I want to make is under international human rights law, the threshold is even higher in terms of making sure that you've exhausted all alternatives. It's not clear the United States has done so. And under U.S. domestic law, which is a bit more permissive about the use of force in these kind of situations, the AUMF, or the authorization to use military force, still specifies that the target be involved in the 9/11 attacks. And the recent expansion of the drone campaign beyond Al-Qaeda and the Taliban raises questions about whether or not we've gone beyond the legislative requirements to do that. So that's kind of a brief sketch of legal, and Jim's going to cut me off in a couple minutes, but just to sketch out the strategic points that we really evaluated. So really we wanted to end our report by saying, even if you don't really care about the civilian consequences or the legality, we argue that there are serious questions about the effectiveness of whether or not drones actually improve the security of the United States on several levels. First, we look at the intelligence, and to put it succinctly, the same type of intelligence, relying on local assets, offering bounties for intelligence, that was used to put people in Guantanamo Bay. And we found that nearly 80% of those in Guantanamo Bay were never charged, right? And 92% were found to not be part of Al-Qaeda. We're using that same intelligence to kill people without due process. Secondly, we look at the fact that according to White House studies and other studies, only 2% of those that have been killed are actually leaders of armed non-state groups. So the majority of those being killed are actually, low-level targets. And the stat from the New York Times that says that, we count militants to be anybody, unless there's evidence post facto that they were actually civilians, casts doubt on whether or not that's hiding a large amount of civilian deaths. And of course, there are larger questions about whether a decapitation strategy works with a horizontal group like Al-Qaeda. The second thing we raised questions about is about the blowback effect, or the effect on facilitating recruitment to non-state groups. And again, there's a lot of quotes in the report, you saw some in the video, but many people told us, as Jim pointed out, that many didn't know what the United States was, didn't have a strong opinion about the United States. They live in a really kind of remote part of Pakistan until drones started to strike. And as Pew data has shown us, now 74% of Pakistanis consider the United States to be an enemy, even though we provide Pakistan with millions of dollars in aid every year. So the final couple points, and I'll wrap up, because I've gotten this card, is that drones undermine U.S. credibility not only in Pakistan but elsewhere in the world, and we cite data about the unpopularity of drones elsewhere. And finally, there are serious geopolitical consequences. Now, 76 nations have drone technology. We saw recently Hezbollah flying drones over Israel. We know that states like Russia and China and many others in the region now have drones. What are the implications? What is the legal precedent we are setting by using drones and using an argument that can be used by other states to attack people not friendly to them?
So, thank you everyone on the panel, and for Omar for reining it in, and for his transparency, which is another area which we called on this administration to be more forthcoming. His transparency with my